Good evening. This is right, it's a conversation, exactly. Good evening. I'm Jonathan Millen, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences here at UNE, and welcome to the second Ludcke Lecture of this academic year. As a reminder, the Ludcke Chair honors senior faculty members who are among UNE's most distinguished scholar teachers. Indeed, to be a Ludcke Chair is to be nationally and internationally recognized in one's field. This award celebrates the importance of vibrant, original, ongoing scholarly activity to the mission of UNE and of CAS, and the educational importance of modeling and sharing that scholarly activity with our students. Jennifer Tuttle was the recipient of the 2021 Ludcke Chair, and tonight will present a talk titled Lost and Found in LA, Recovering the Life and Writing of Dora L. Mitchell. Jennifer is the Dorothy M. Healy Chair of Literature and Health, Professor of English, the Director of the Maine's Women's Writers Collection, and a co-founder of our Women's and Gender Studies program. Her accomplishments include 3 books, 21 other publications, 2 films, 28 invited talks at national and international venues, and over 40 competitive conference presentations. She has been the recipient of numerous awards and prestigious nominations, including her designation as Distinguished Alumna of the University of California at San Diego Department of Literature, the Scatterly, I hope I'm saying that right, Shasterly, the Shasterly Prize, awarded by the Society for Literature, Science, and the Arts for the Best New Essay on Literature and Science, and several nominations for the Modern Language Association's Morton N. Cohen Award for Distinguished Editor of Letters. Jennifer's work is a reminder of the true breadth of the liberal arts in UNE's CAS. While the unfortunate reality is that many institutions of higher education are struggling with how to situate their arts and humanities in the current landscape, Jennifer and her colleagues have carved out a position of strength that embraces true interdisciplinarity, a sense of openness and discovery, and a spirit of possibility. What's most impressive to me is that this overall disposition permeates both their curriculum and their scholarship. In this regard, Jennifer is a role model for the Ludcke Chair. Tonight, Jennifer will share her discoveries about Dora L. Mitchell, a prolific code switcher whose life and writing are nearly invisible in the historical record. As a Black woman, one generation removed from slavery, who sometimes self-concealed through racial passing, Mitchell was someone whose story was easily marginalized, ignored, and obscured, and whose work was easily lost. But she reveals much about Black women's opinions for navigating California's literary landscape in the early 20th century. With that, Jennifer.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming in. Jonathan, thank you for that very gracious introduction. Very generous, too. So I want to acknowledge, of course, to begin, that we're holding this event on Wabanaki land and adjacent to their waters. So I proceed with humility and respect. I'm also incredibly grateful to have been granted sabbatical and especially the honor of the Ludcke Chair. And I'd like to thank the Ludcke family for their support and to thank the previous Ludcke Chairs, the Research and Scholarship Committee, and the Women's and Gender Studies faculty who nominated me for recognizing the value of my work. Also, none of this could have happened without Aaron Stetson in the Dean's office, Lee Cody and Dave Dadiego, and everyone from Parkhurst, housekeeping, and facilities who made this possible. I also just have a million other people to thank, so I've left a little time at the end for that. So I'm going to begin with a few quick words of context for the work that I did last year. I've been working steadily on a long-term project. It's a book. Let's see if I can get this to work. A book about medical discourse in California women's writing at the turn of the last century. And my particular focus is nervousness, or the technical term neurasthenia. The project pushes back at the prevailing framework for thinking about California's early decades as a state, 1850 to 1920, roughly, when it was deliberately constructed as a natural sanitarium, a site of regeneration to promote Anglo-American settlement and conquest. And I'm in the process now of trying to rethink the colonizer's perspective and the masculinist orientation of that framework and of that history that's really remained largely unquestioned. And I'm also questioning the narrow archive of sources used, therefore, to support that narrative. So I'm asking questions like, how would this history look different if we included texts written by white women who invoked neurasthenia to achieve some bodily self-determination? What does it mean to consider the perspectives of California women who were variously excluded from political and racial belonging, such as those of Mexican, African, Asian, and Jewish ancestry and ethnicity? So how did they, appropriate the discourse of nervousness in their representations? And how must the state's role in medical history be redefined to accommodate the perspectives of indigenous people for whom nervous settler health seekers portended not just illness but destruction? So the chapters I've worked on so far, I've come to realize I was incredibly lucky and I had it so easy because I knew of these writers' existence. I knew what they wrote. I had access to their material. Their papers were collected in archives. There were already conversations going on among literary critics in which I could intervene. But the phase of my project that I'm involved in now is much harder and much more important. It addresses the glaring absences in the historical record. So because African American perspectives were not yet represented in my research, during my sabbatical, I began learning more about California's Black history, and I was on the lookout for primary sources around which a new chapter could cohere. Anything that would lend itself to literary analysis, I was game. So I was looking for something produced by a woman, someone identifying as non-binary perhaps, something that intersected with the themes and early time period of my book. And all of that turned out to be a tall order. I was aware of the stellar work of literary historians who have focused on this early period that I work on, who have noted that African Americans often published in the West in what Eric Gardner has called unexpected places. So partly that's regional. They were unexpected in the West. That's a region that remains very under-investigated in African American literary recovery. But also, Black writers had less access to mainstream white-controlled publishing venues. They were less likely to have the leisure to publish the kinds of high-profile literary work that more privileged writers produced. Their writing was more likely to appear in non-elite or Black-run newspapers, church and club newsletters, mutual aid organization records, and other unpublished forms. And it was less likely to be saved, preserved, and archived. So that being the case, I read all the scholarship I could find that might indirectly reveal sources I could pursue. I read their endnotes and then the endnotes of their endnoted works. Did I just cut out? Am I back? Okay. I scoured online finding aids of California archives that held the records of Black individuals and families and organizations. I reached out to perfect strangers who might talk to me about their work and help me find leads. And I'd like especially to thank Kalenda Eaton, Allison Rose Jefferson, and John Portlock for their help. I reached out to scores of archivists and librarians, and I read reels and reels of microfilmed Black newspapers from before the 1920s. And I have a special bond now with the microfilm reader at USM's Glickman Library. In fact, I was spending days and days there at the same time that Noah Perlute, my colleague, was in the Galapagos doing his research. So clearly I'm devoted to this. Okay. Whenever I found a likely individual, I tracked down anything they were known to have left behind. If I could find it, I read it. I ended up reading a lot of interesting work, but none of it was appropriate for my project. In the process, though, I stumbled across, and I don't even now remember how, an IMDb entry for a woman named Dora Mitchell. And other than the 2 films associated with this biography, I had no information about what she published, although the entry did indicate some of the genres that she published in. So it wasn't as if I could do what I'd done with some of the other writers that I'd been pursuing that fall and, try to track something down through interlibrary loan or archival duplication request and then try to read it. I just didn't even know where to begin almost. And I had no idea then whether Mitchell's writing would intersect with the themes of my book. I knew she was in the right time period, but I just trusted my gut, and I'm glad I did, because it turns out that she did invoke neurasthenia in her work in very interesting ways. But doing this research was an enormous undertaking. This is a person who, as Jonathan said, reading my pithy summary, right, is almost entirely invisible in the historical record, about whom there's 0 scholarship, and whose very works themselves required months of dogged research even to identify, then to find, then to obtain, let alone read and analyze. So for many of these, I spent weeks and weeks searching, only to come up empty-handed. Dora Mitchell did produce a whole variety of creative work, but nearly all of it appeared in low-profile and notoriously ephemeral venues: newspaper inserts, Black-produced silent film, Black newspapers, pulp magazines. It turns out that many traces of Mitchell's life and work have, in some cases, quite literally crumbled into dust. So I spent a lot of my time reading archival absences and making creative use of what remains. Now, all of that said, I did find out quite a lot about Mitchell and her work, about her family and ancestors, and most exciting, through Ancestry.com, I was put in touch with 2 family members, extended family members, because she had no children, but her, her grandniece, Danette Devereaux, and if you're watching, Danette, hi. I think she might be, and her niece by marriage, Barbara Scruggs. And both of these incredible people have been generous with their time and encouragement, helping me over the phone and email, giving me their blessing. And that's been the most rewarding part of my research, is meeting them and working with them. So the work's still ongoing. I've barely gotten started, but I do have findings to share. In fact, I could talk to you about Dora Mitchell for hours, and you don't want me to do that, so I'm just going to tell you a tiny fraction of what I found. And I'm going to begin by giving you a little overview of Mitchell's life and work, and then I'm at the early stages of analyzing her use of medical discourse. So instead of talking about that, I'm going to go meta, and I'm going to spend some time talking about my research process, because it speaks directly to the question of what it means to recover Black women writers from unmerited historical invisibility. So first, the overview. Dora Mitchell was born in Los Angeles in 1891, and she was the consummate code switcher. Throughout her life, she went by Dora and Dolores for her first name, Mitchell and Michelle for her last. Sometimes she added a middle initial or masked her identity with a pen name. Sometimes she fused her authorship with others in a composite pen name. And at the time of her death in 1970, she was going by the name Dolores Michelle and identifying herself as white. She grew up in South Central LA amid a rapidly growing community of Black Angelenos, and her family members are also fascinating. Her mother, Medora, ran a hand laundry business out of their home, and her father, Peter, ran a restaurant and also cooked in other people's restaurants. As girls, Dora and her sister Maud helped out with the laundry, but at age 18, in 1909, Dora was swept off her feet by a brazen con artist going by the name of Daniel Antonio Maceo, whom she all too promptly married, and this introduced major drama into her life. Maceo had recently arrived in California, purporting to be the only acknowledged son of Cuban liberator General Antonio Maceo Grajales. And Dora was as impressed as anyone by his act. He was outrageous. But within 3 days of their wedding, Maceo was arrested on swindling charges and then publicly unmasked in an LA Times expose as an imposter. So that introduced awkwardness into the marriage. The next 4 months, the family lived at the Mitchell home because Maceo secured a quick release from jail. And during that time, Maceo attempted to murder his wife through introducing carbolic acid into her food gradually. And that came to a head on Christmas when he poisoned the entire family's Christmas dinner, and a violent confrontation ensued, and then he fled the house, and Dora attempted to report him to the police, but she was not believed by the police. On unrelated charges, Maceo was then brought up before the Lunacy Commission, and then was soon released, and then left town. Mitchell divorced him 5 years later in absentia in 1914. I discovered this after a positively Kafkaesque research process involving the LA Superior Court Archives and Records Office. Soon after Maceo left, Mitchell assumed a non-black identity and found work as a stenographer in a Hollywood real estate office. Until 1926, she went by both Mitchell and Michelle, using her black and non-black identities contextually. She wrote and translated for silent films under both names and racial identifications. Under her birth name, she held a short-lived job as a reporter at LA's premier black newspaper, the California Eagle. And she worked for over a decade, passing as either white or Latina, as a stenographer at the LA Police Department's Detective Bureau. This is the very same station where she had previously been dismissed while reporting her husband's violent attack. As I said, she's known to have published fiction in both white and black newspapers, as well as a whole variety of pulp magazines, and to have co-written at least 2 plays. I'm sure she wrote other things as well, but I just haven't found them. So I'll keep you posted. She didn't remarry, didn't have any children, so there's no one, of course, to hold on to her possessions. So after her death, no idea. Probably they were pitched. As far as I know, there exists in the world one archival folder with her name on it. That's at UCLA, and it relates to her film work, and it is very sparse. So I have no photographs of her, no immediate family papers to examine. Thankfully, members of her sister's family, the aforementioned Danette and Barbara, have been very generous in sharing memories with me. But they were at some remove from her, so those were few. Other than that, and the UCLA folder, I basically started from scratch. So as I mentioned, I've not been able to find some of Mitchell's creative work, and many of it may not be extant. Those absences hit me hard, let me tell you, and they have their own fascinating stories. But I did manage to track down some of her writing, and so I'm going to share a couple examples with you. One of them being a story called The Shadowed Witness that she published in the California Eagle in 1923. So, sitting at my second home, the microfilm reader at USM, I read all those black newspapers, and I noticed chronological gaps in the California Eagle, and those included 1923. So I was like, okay, we don't have that. Eventually, after much too long, I figured out that 1923 was included in the run of the paper that was available in Internet Archive, which must have used different microfilm as, the basis for its source material. that I had received through ILL. So there I found Dora Mitchell and The Shadowed Witness, which came out that year. Now, microfilm in analog or digital form is a godsend when paper originals are missing, or when it's unclear where they might be housed, or when one is researching remotely. But it is not often easy to work with. It's not uncommon to encounter notices like this or this, right? Here's one page of The Shadowed Witness, which was published serially in 3 weekly installments. And you'll notice yet another vagary of microfilm, which is that the quality of the images is, shall we say, poor, uneven. So in Internet Archive, you can scroll laterally through each page in turn, or you can look at individual pages in PDF, organized by issue date and page number. But here's the thing, they often get it wrong. So the California Eagle was published once a week, and each issue contained 8 pages, although each issue's publication date only appeared on page 1. So if you're randomly looking at some other page, you don't necessarily know what page number it is or what date it was. Okay, so there's that. Internet Archive misdated, misnumbered, and therefore misordered the pages of Mitchell's story, making it appear that the story's denouement, remember, this is a murder mystery, right? The final installment where all is revealed supposedly was published in August, but the first 2 sections supposedly didn't appear until 4 months later in December. Okay, and this would have been highly inconvenient for a whodunit, right? So in this example on the screen, you can see there's a lot going on December 21st for an 8-page newspaper, right? So the first and second installments supposedly are indexed here as appearing on pages 15, 18, and 35 in December. Again, there is no such, right? Correspondingly, the newspaper issues in which the story actually appeared, which it turns out were in July, if I clicked on those, you would see they're either missing the relevant pages, missing entirely from their month, or misidentified. So you could not hide this story more effectively if you tried. The only way to find the story and read it coherently, I learned, is through searching through Mitchell's name in Internet Archive, which doesn't always work because AI can't really read old newsprint very well. And then using internal evidence on each separate page to date that page and then put them in order. But finding the story and then figuring all of this out was totally worth it because the story is incredibly interesting. It's set in the San Francisco Bay Area, and it tells the story of a black man who has been framed for murdering a white man and is saved from the gallows by the courtroom heroics of a black attorney. It's typical of what Brooks Hefner describes of black newspaper fiction from the early 20th century, in that it narrates racial injustice and melodramatic redemption. And this is for readers who are used to seeing black characters as reductive stereotypes marginal to the plot, who are firsthand experiencing the criminalization of blackness, and who knew African Americans to have few allies in the justice system. So, you know, California had long drawn black migrants, especially from the South, because the opportunities that it offered relative to the Jim Crow South were better. But still, California's black citizens had constantly to fight to obtain and retain the rights to which they were entitled. One historian, excellent historian named Douglas Flaming, puts it well when he says that California during Dora Mitchell's time was a half-free city. So black newspapers like the California Eagle regularly contrasted the idealized West in the American imagination with the realities of racial discrimination that African Americans experienced there. And Mitchell's story dovetails really nicely and profoundly with this mission of the larger newspaper where it appeared. So although in its current form it's not, just seriously, not findable or readable, in any coherent way. I am publishing a profile of Dora Mitchell later this year, and it includes a reprint of the story because I really felt that it was worthy of people's attention, being taught and studied, and it's just simply not possible to do it using Internet Archive, just not. So at the same time that Mitchell was publishing anti-racist newspaper fiction under her birth name, she was also building a repertoire of stories in pulp magazines under the race and gender neutral pen name of D.L. Michelle. And this may have allowed her to circumvent the politics of respectability that complicated Black women's negotiation of the sort of social and sexual permissiveness of the 1920s. And it also paid her a penny a word. Just a little literary context. Between World War I and World War II, pulp magazines were all the rage. And most of them were totally lowbrow, sensational, escapist, no standards of believability or good taste, logic, full of misogyny, ethnic stereotypes, xenophobia, and they also sold in the tens of millions. So by definition and by design, they were not supposed to last. I mean, they were literally made of cheap wood pulp paper, designed to be thrown away after being read. They're notoriously difficult to research because those that somehow did survive are not indexed accurately anywhere. They aren't archived reliably. And pulp fiction has been largely dismissed by literary critics, so there's not a lot of trails to follow in the scholarship either. But thankfully, they are hugely popular among non-academics, fans, and collectors, and they provide the best leads I've found. And so I started, for example, with the Fiction Mag's Index. And I was really excited to see so many things under Mitchell's name. Many of her things were actually published as D.L. Michelle, but they list her as Dolores. This is just an index, though. So those links, they just take you to other places in the index. They don't take you to actual sources. So that was a bummer. But anyway, you know, and it's not complete. There are things she published that I've found that aren't on there. But, oh my gosh, it was such a big help, place to start. After I made my preliminary list, then I appealed to Kathleen Miller, who saved my bacon because she helped me figure out a plan for finding more. So I looked in WorldCat, I looked in Archive Grid, I looked in Google, just trying to figure out where might these magazines live, who has what. And in a few cases I got lucky and I found them already online. So there are some sources like the Pulp Magazine Library or the Internet Archive that have some scanned issues, and I could find some of Dora's stories that way. But I ended up obtaining many of them on microfilm through ILL. So again, interlibrary loan to the rescue. The thing is, that didn't always work out. I mean, I was, again, back at the microfilm reader for those. But then, you know, sometimes I would get messages like this, right? Your request was canceled because we've exhausted all possible sources. Yeah. And no, I'm not done, right? So then I would go on and try to find them myself. And then I would get stuff like this. Unfortunately, the runs are incomplete. We don't have any of the issues you need. We might have the magazine, but we don't have the issues you need. Or, oh yeah, we used to have that, but then we discarded it. And oh, sorry, we didn't take it out of our catalog. Or, oh yeah, we do have that, but it's temporarily not available because we're doing something with it. I mean, we're preserving it or cataloging it, and so it could take months before we'll have this for you. So multiply this by 10, and that is how my year went. But I did track down 20 of her 23 stories, and so far, so some of these were what we call saucy pulp. So these are, you know, titillating, romance-themed papers, lots of extramarital sex and whatever, liberated flappers, would-be scoundrels seducing them or trying to. And then she also published a lot of detective fiction and true crime. And what's interesting about the true crime stories is that, I love gun malls, by the way, that's my favorite. She drew on her work at the LAPD. So she took statements. She's a stenographer. She took statements from crime victims, right? Worked closely with detectives, and then recycled the material in pulp magazines, where she's the author. Totally interesting, and especially, I mean, you might be thinking, right? Oh yeah, but wait, she gave her statement when she was 18, a young black woman going to, right, the LAPD to report the assault by her husband. Didn't have a voice then, but she does now. Totally interesting. So there's tons of interesting stuff going on with her pulp writing that I'm still working on processing. Now, while I was tracking down Mitchell's writing, it was obviously crucial to my project to find out about her life, her background, her family, her ancestors, and the material conditions in which she lived. That's vitally important. So, aside from the obvious fact that that information shapes interpretations of her work, I pursued this biological research for the quite simple reason that the lives of Mitchell and her ancestors mattered. They're an important part of American history, Black history, women's history, Western history, and they deserve to be counted, right? If we want to get a more inclusive and accurate vision of the past, no brainer. So I learned a lot about Mitchell's background and her family in my research, but here again, I repeatedly contended with the problem of historical erasure of Black women and Black people. And one telling example is the Mitchell's family home. From city directories and voting records and census records, I knew that Dora Mitchell's family owned their own home, and that's a significant opportunity that the West offered African Americans more often than elsewhere in the United States. And the Mitchells lived in this home for a long time. They lived there from about 1901 until about 1927. And it was there that Mitchell spent her formative years. You'll find out in a minute why. I literally can't show you a picture of it, though. Wish I could. Spent her formative years there, her short marriage, lived there until her 30s. And it was there that her mother, Medora, established the family business that gave the family access to a lot of the perks of middle-class life, and provided their support and a place, a haven of protection in certain ways. So Mitchell's half-niece wrote a memoir in which she reminisces fondly about this house, and she refers to it as Grandma's big house at 22nd and Los Angeles Streets, at that time a good distance from the center of the city. There were fig trees and orange trees in the backyard, and huge pepper trees and hitching posts for horses in the front of the house. And so when I traveled to LA for my research, I sought out this address, and this is what I found. I know, right? So, I mean, I'd kind of gotten a sense of this from Google Maps, but I was like, please let it not be true, and it was true. So 1961 South Los Angeles Street is now a parking lot, a vacant spot between two structures. And so as such, I see it as emblematic of the Mitchell family's invisibility today. The traces of their lives are not just lost, but paved over by a narrative that has left them behind. And I found this to be true again and again. Another example is Medora's headstone. So the entire family is buried at Angeles Rosedale Cemetery, the first integrated cemetery in LA. And they didn't have a family plot, so their graves are scattered around, but I found them, and that was really exciting. But what confused me for a while was that I couldn't find Peter Mitchell, Dora's father, Medora's husband. Couldn't find him anywhere, even though his name showed up in the cemetery records. So I chatted up the cemetery employee, and he told me that Peter had died a few years after Medora. I knew when Peter died, but he said that his cremains were placed inside Medora's grave. Now, he died in the 1930s, so I'm sure that there was no money for another plot, right? And clearly there was not money to add him to the headstone. So, and Peter Mitchell is one of the people about whom the least is known. So it was especially poignant to see him, completely unfindable in his final resting place. Medora is somewhat more visible, but only after an enormous amount of searching. So this is the only photograph of her that I've been able to find, and it's unfortunately blurry. In fact, I was able to learn a lot more about Medora than I was able to learn about Dora. Medora's story is incredibly compelling. She was born with slave status on a farm near Norfolk, Virginia. Her enslaver was also her father. She self-emancipated when she was 12 years old, finding work as a cabin girl on a ship of a Boston sea captain whose family took her in. In Boston, she met and married her first husband, James Thompson, and had her first daughter. And with this family, she migrated to Denver, Colorado in 1879. Not unusually, their aptitudes and talents far exceeded the jobs that they were able to secure due to racial discrimination. Medora worked as a domestic servant, often living in with her employers, while James worked as a waiter and a Pullman porter. Now I knew that Medora and James divorced, and I knew when Medora married Dora's father, Peter, her second husband, in LA. But I did not know where they divorced. Was it California? Was it Colorado? Right? I didn't know exactly when they divorced either. So it took a long time to track down their divorce records, but finally I found them with the help of an archivist at the Huntington Library. So I made an appointment, and I traveled to LA, and I went in there, and I paged the materials, and then the box arrived, unassuming, dark gray box, and there they were. These records, exactly as they had been when they were bundled together 132 years before, and no one had clearly ever done anything with them since. So, you have to imagine the reading room at the Huntington Library. Incredibly quiet, like fancy. And I'm like, because, these are really, really stiff old paper, so it was really embarrassing for a few minutes, but I just, I laid them out, and I started reading. And the divorce, it turns out, was acrimonious, which was really good for me because it required depositions. And one of those depositions was from Medora's mother, Louisa Reed, who, it turns out, had escaped from slavery as well and had gone with Medora to Denver and then ended up with her in LA. Finding historical records is thrilling and helpful, but sometimes they can obscure as much as they reveal. So when I had earlier found Medora's marriage record to James Thompson in the census, did I go to the right page? No, this is not it yet. This is just the marriage record from Massachusetts. And I saw that she'd listed her parents' names as John and Mary. So I'm searching for Mary. I was searching for Medora's mother under the wrong name. Louisa, though, had been under my nose the entire time, and I just didn't know it because I didn't know her name. Because early on, I had found Medora and James in the Denver census in 1880, living at the home of Medora's employer, the Van Vliets. But what I didn't realize then was that Louisa had come with them and gotten a job with their next-door neighbor, the Abels. So she's literally there the whole time, and I had no idea. It took months for me to go back to these records and realize, oh, there's Louisa, but I didn't know her name. So sometimes you have to go back over your sources again and again because they, become newly illuminating. In later records, I also found out that there were other family members who self-emancipated together with them in the 1860s and also lived with Louisa at times, and the information in those documents strengthened my confidence that I had, in fact, traced the family back to the records of their enslaver and Medora's biological father. Medora's biological father, Dora's biological grandfather, John Reed. So I haven't had time or resources to dig into this further to confirm that this is indeed where Dora Mitchell's ancestors were, and I haven't yet been able to trace anyone back any further other than to know that Louisa's parents were also from Virginia and that she identified as African Cherokee. But this official U.S. Census slave schedule is yet another emblematic document. Since it lists 17 human beings, let's see if I can point out all of these people. That says John Reed. Hard to believe. 17 human beings who were the legal property of John Reed. I mean, this historical document doesn't simply obscure people, but actively attempts to erase their humanity. There's literally no column in which their names could be listed. They're listed in the historical record anonymously according to the characteristics that determine their exchange value, their sex and their age. So, as I've said, I've only begun this work. I have a lot more to learn and a lot more thinking to do, but I'm excited about what I've learned so far, and I do believe that studying Mitchell's work as well as her family's lives can add to our understanding of LA's Black history and of the histories and trajectories of Black migration in the United States. Attending to Mitchell's work, reading her work, and studying it can illuminate Black women's contributions to the myriad forms in which she worked. And it will also clarify the early literary history of Black California, in which women now receive scant representation. And it'll diversify understanding of Western women's writing from the period where Black women's literary history is only beginning to be recovered. And finally, on a methodological note, these findings lead me to observe that in order to find and appreciate Black women's creative work in the early West, it's necessary to dramatically enlarge what we consider to be Black literary women's historical archive. Dora Mitchell is Exhibit A for why it's important to rethink expectations about how and where to look for Black women's writing, and why, even when looking in the obvious places, such as Black newspapers, we need to become resistant and persistent readers of the very archives that we have built to make this work available for study. So as I conclude, I just want to thank the many, many people whose help and labor made my own work possible. First, so many people at UNE supported my research financially through various kinds of work that made it possible for me to be away for a year. Many offered moral support or read and responded to my ginormously long research write-ups, like my book group, I'm Looking at You, and my partner. Also, there are professional colleagues beyond UNE who helped me quite generously. And there are the librarians and archivists. UNE gets pride of place at the beginning, but with historical research like mine, you see me up here alone. But that's really not fair because, I'm presenting my findings, but I could not have done any of this without the help of literally scores and scores of librarians and archivists. And they're unseen multitudes, to quote Hawthorne, right, whose invisible labor makes mine possible. And just to drive home the point, I will note that that's just page 1. Come on, man. There you go. Page 2. So I thank all of those individuals and everyone here for coming and being so avidly attentive and supportive. And with that, I will wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was
You're welcome.
absolutely wonderful.
Thank
Your passion and enthusiasm are quite contagious.
Thank you.
A quick question of maybe clarification and elaboration. You talked a little bit about the business at home with the laundry, and Peter was a cook and a chef, and then that allowed the middle class opportunities. But then upon his death, you said that they didn't have funds for. So I'm wondering about their relative economic status and how that might have changed over the course of their life.
Good question. Well, I guess I'll say, first of all, look, So background for that answer, for the answer to that question is, I mean, Medora, her life, she lived a long time. She was incredible, and she worked so hard in so many ways, to build up a laundry clientele in Denver first. She actually bought her own home there too. I didn't have time to tell you that. And then in LA. So, what that meant was that the family had a roof over their heads, a stable one that they weren't renting. They owned it. She made sure that all her kids, she had 4 kids, they all had education, and were able to go off into the world and do meaningful work, or in some cases like Maud, Dora's sister, she married someone and ended up doing well, keeping a roof over her head. But then, of course, by the 1930s, what had happened is Medora had died. Previous to that, she had moved into a nursing home, and they had sold the house. Again, I think it was around 1927, but oh my God, don't even get me started on trying to find the records of that. I need to go there again and just knock on doors. So, and it was a Great Depression. So I think that it was really that, Dora chose to pass, and that provided her with economic opportunities that she would not have had otherwise. But even she, I don't think she's living high on the hog either. She's just making ends meet, living in apartments, So I don't think that there was necessarily a subsequent fall in economic status. I think it was more the family sort of broke up and went their own way. They no longer had the home base of, this sort of not paying rent all the time in the home, and Great Depression. So that's my sense of why that happened. So you're welcome. If I had enough money, I would put Peter's name on that headstone, and maybe someday I will.
Question over here.
Hi, Jennifer.
Hi.
So this is wonderful. So in so many ways, you brought Los Angeles history to little old Biddeford. But LA history is history of LA, history of cities, history of the West. It's African American history, and African American history is American history. Yep. And you have so nicely talked about the real challenge in uncovering the stories of African Americans through the 19th and 20th century. My thought, too, piggybacking off of what Dean Millen was talking about, and the reasons why the Mitchell family struggled financially in the Great Depression and after. My thought with your time period, the 1850 to 1910s, 1920s, is this golden age or golden era, however you want to call it, of Black Los Angeles history. And you're nodding because you're familiar with it. It's a time when the West, especially Los Angeles, was just developing, and so there weren't. So it's kind of, for lack of a better word, it's kind of the Wild West, and people were claiming Los Angeles and claiming California, and so there was this kind of contestation over who will eventually get the land, and of course it's the white population in the federal government that does so. But during these decades, in this golden age, blacks were able to live in all different parts of the city, and purchase homes. The home ownership was high in the early 20th century, unlike other cities. And then with the increase of discrimination and racism in Los Angeles and in California and in the West, as more and more whites move into the area, blacks and other people of color kind of lose those opportunities. So when Mitchell was around writing, it seemed like it was a really a place of opportunity for her, and she was able to really grab onto those opportunities. So it's probably the Depression, but it might be also this increase in nativism and racism
Oh, yeah.
that led to her and her family's challenges. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you, Jen. I mean, by the way, if you haven't read Jennifer Mandel's book, you really should, because it picks up kind of where my project leaves off to talk about the African Americans trying to live in the west side, right, of LA in the decades following. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, again, what's really interesting is that in the 1920s, the family kind of breaks up because Dora has started passing. Because she's passing, starts living in apartments so she grew up in South Central LA at the north end. Although, again, you're right, but when the family bought that home, there weren't restrictive covenants. They could have bought a home anywhere for a whole variety of reasons that I'm not entirely all privy to. They chose that spot, the north end of South Central. But in the 20s, they get rid of the house, and Maud marries and goes off with her husband. Peter had moved up to Hanford, California, because he and Medora split up. And Dora moved up to Echo Park, Silver Lake, West Hollywood, living in apartments as a white woman and working at the LAPD. And so they're just literally they gave up the house, I suspect, partly to pay for Medora's nursing home. And then there was no going back after that. So, yeah, it's really quite interesting and poignant, too. Other questions? I will just say, while you're handing that to Peyton, one reason why I spent some time talking about the project in the way I did is because I know that, there's basically like one person, maybe two people in here who are sort of specialists, right, who know. And I want to make sure that the kind of larger issues about doing humanities research, especially historical humanities research, are intelligible to people, because I think there aren't necessarily a lot of people at UNE who have a sense of what does it actually mean to do that. So Peyton, what was your question?
First off, amazing job.
Oh, thank you.
I think this is more of a generalized question for mostly youth. Racism, discrimination, and sexism, I think, is still present today. And you made a comment about being resistant and persistent readers. Mm-hmm. And I know that youth want to be more involved. So what would be your best advice to be a persistent and resistant reader?
Oh, what a nice question. Thank you. Well, first of all, I think you should apply that to every single text you encounter in your life. I think we all should, right? And we can define text very loosely, and should, I think. We're saturated with texts now, right? But I think, if you are doing historical research, in part what that means is don't give up. If someone tells you that, well, there is nothing written about this person or this population. If someone tells you, no, we can't provide that for you, I'm not going to give up if they tell me that. I mean, right? I mean, I'm going to become a pain in someone's you-know-what by just constantly trying to, go about it myself. Because I guess, I think what you said really underlies what we all need to do, which is identify what's important to us and what matters, and don't let those roadblocks get in your way. And again, when you're doing historical research, that often means, you have to, it's messy and frustrating and recursive and whatever. You just have to spend, it'll take months and lots of grief to get your hands on this or that source. But, I know these people existed. I know that their lives were important and tell us important things that we should all know more about. And so, fine, the beginning of my sabbatical, I was like, I'm going to research 2 chapters and I'm going to, start writing it. Right? No, I didn't. But I I think it's important to set ambitious goals, right? But I just sort of found out that the nature of the topic means that no, it's going to take a gazillion times longer than you think. It's going to require funding, which I was very fortunate to have because of the Ludcke Award. And it's going to require, that you not give up. So again, there's a bigger question about dealing with text in the world. Totally apply that there. But if you are committed to doing archival research, if you want to do historical research, remain steadfast in your conviction that your topic is important and worth researching and worth finding out about, and but be prepared that it might take a really long time and you might get a lot of no's. Other thing I'll say is that, it's a really good idea to reach out to other people and put your neck out there, even if you don't know them. I did that a million times. I reached out to, oh my God, Allison Rose Jefferson. She is the most generous, amazing historian. She's in LA, and she does all kinds of amazing work on LA's Black history. And I don't know her, but I just emailed her and I said, can you help me with this or that? I don't even remember what the first thing was I asked her. And she was incredible and so kind. And, I read more and more of her work that she provided me, but she also just helped give me leads and just moral support. And so finding like-minded people, asking for help. Sometimes people aren't going to write back. Don't let that stop you. Try the next person. Anything else? Brian.
Thanks, Lee. Really incredible stuff you found, Jen. So I have a few questions. Maybe I'll try to cram two in quick. One is, and I understand it's incredibly hard to know about Dora because the information is so hidden and haphazard. But
Yeah.
This story from her late teens where she marries
Oh
this
my God.
guy, finds out in 3 days that he's a fraud, then almost is murdered by him.
I know.
It's there's a really interesting thing about her showing up at the LAPD and not being believed, and then working at the LAPD and using that as to get this truthful voice into her stories, as the stenographer. But I wonder just how much is that the fact that she started to become someone who would shift her own identity, shift her own name. How searing was that experience for her to be,
I know.
fall for one of these people and be a victim? So I'm curious a little bit about that, although I understand it's hard to know.
Yeah.
The other question I have is is about your overall project about nervousness, which I find super fascinating. And if this is just sort of this really interesting new path you discovered in the process, or is there a way to fold this work back into this project about the West and nervousness?
Thanks for asking. Yeah, so first thing I should say is about the issue of her marriage and what it meant, all this meant to her. I would not presume to say, far be it from me. All I want to do is try to be empathetic, to listen, to read as much as I can, but I can, because I'm not going to cross a boundary that I think is inappropriate for me, especially as a white woman. I nonetheless want to do everything I can to elicit, what the information that exists, and try to see if we can find more about her perspective and her voice. And no letters, no diary, nothing. I got nothing, right? Because I mean, maybe somewhere there will be some way to find more, but in the absence of that, I wish I had more to work with right now. But again, I'm just starting, so we'll see. So as to the book, so I will admit, okay, so first of all, yes, there's a lot of really fascinating stuff going on with neurasthenia in The Shadowed Witness, which is super interesting to me, and that's my next task, is to draft that chapter from the book about that. She also uses it in her pulp fiction sometimes in ways that I'm still working on, trying to figure out what the heck is she doing with that. So I have material to work with there, because I really think it's fascinating to think about, how as this kind of code switching, boundary crossing, almost trickster, textual trickster figure, how is she kind of intervening in that conversation in ways that are either overt or covert. So I'm working on that, but I don't have a lot to say about that yet because that's a whole other conversation. But I will admit to you that I had moments during this last year where I was just so interested in her and finding out about her family. I mean, I could write a whole book about Medora. I mean, really, I kind of almost did, and my writing group read all of it. They're incredibly generous people. And so I did have moments where I was like, oh, I just want to write this book now, but there's this book. So, I'm just trying to not be seduced by all of the 6 million different projects that this material is inspiring in me, and keep my eye on the one I'm already have been in the midst of for a really long time, thinking about and reworking. But then I may come back and do more with that later. So I don't know how much time we have, and I don't want to keep people. I don't have a sense of how long this goes. Does anyone? Lee? One more question? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, hi.
I wanted to ask how, you kept mentioning that Dora, was able to, mask her identity as, a white woman.
Mm-hmm.
She, had, 2 identities, a black and, a white woman.
Mm-hmm.
How was she able to, do that?
Such
Especially, back then? I just wanted to see, what she maybe, looked like or something. I don't know.
I know. I want to know, too. I'm just really? There are no pictures anywhere? But I do know from both talking to her family and a very smattering of reading about the family that she was very light-complected. She could pass, especially in Southern California. She could pass as Latina, potentially. So I only know what's been reported about her, sort of outward presentation. I know, so her, oh my goodness, sister's son, please make sure I got this right, Odie Scruggs, he was an incredible person. He was a Harvard-educated historian, American historian, published a lot of stuff, really important work. He, in one reference of something he published in a preface or an afterword to a completely different, something nothing to do with his family, he talked about his family, and he said that his Aunt Dora did pass when she worked at the police department, and he said she couldn't have gotten that job if she didn't. So, he wrote a lot about passing and about the kind of fraught, issues that it raises. And the family's really interesting, too, because, so Medora was very light-complected, and as was Dora, as was Maud, evidently. Maud was staunchly opposed to passing, as were some other members of the family. But Medora, I'm pretty sure, passed as white to get into her nursing home, which, she needed a place to age in place, to die, and so that's what she chose to do. So it's just, the whole family is very fascinating in that way, but it makes me insane that I have so few resources that all I can draw upon is, okay, one last thing I'll say, sorry I'm droning on, but for example, there are census records, and the census asks, what is your racial identification, right? Well, I don't know what to do with that because A, their categories change every 10 years. So the different categories are different depending on which year. Then there's the whole problem of the 1890 census, which got lost in a fire, which I can't even go there without crying. So I'm not going to talk about that. But then, you don't know Who wrote that down? Was it the census taker who looked at this person and said, oh, they're white? Or did the person report? Yeah, I don't know. No way to know. Probably some of each. So you take the records that exist, you try to kind of put it all together in a coherent story and use a little logic and just try to make sense of what you think is probably what happened. But I think that's why she was able to manage that. And of course, textually, no one knows, right? She sends it in to the Pulp magazine. No one knows who D.L. Michelle is. They don't even know if she's a woman. But with the work in person, that's trickier. So lots of unanswered questions. I wish I knew more, but I think that's it. Well, I feel like I may be overstaying my welcome, so I'm good. Are there any other questions? You guys want to? I will be hanging out for a few minutes, though, if you want to ask me afterward. But I know it's a weeknight, so I'm going to turn you loose now. Thank you very much for coming.